So long to find a link that worked, you know? Sorry, that's my job.
That's all right. Hi, folks. Welcome to GAAC. Everything seems to be working this evening. All right, tonight we've got Kristine Larsen from Central Connecticut State College or the university now?
The university, since since the year before I graduated, it turned into a university. That was many moons ago.
Wow, cool. Anyway, I looked at her CV, which is online, and I was going to print it up, but I didn't have enough paper. I'm not joking.
Yeah, it kills a lot of trees. Yeah.
I was going to get a big piece of yarn and make it as long as the CV would be had I printed it, and I didn't have enough yarn. So I have a copy of it as a PDF, and if anybody wants to take a look at this amazing CV, just let me know, and I'll send you a copy. Maybe you'd want to offer her tenure somewhere. Anyway, she's done all this incredible academic work and a lot of research related to women in astronomy, past, present, and future. And she's also, as I said in my my reminder, got some serious street credit. She ground her own mirror, installed it in an f4.6 diameter equatorial.
It's a Newtonian, and I'm actually this close to finishing a 12.5-inch mirror. COVID set me back. I just have to parabolize it.
Wow, way to go. All right, and I get the reflector, and I had not looked and seen your name on it. Very good. So we already know each other. All right, so without further ado, let's have a nice round of applause for our speaker.
Thank you all for having me, and thank you for putting up with the technology issues. And I talk about something that's sort of near and dear to my heart because it, well, as you'll see, I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I got to be here to speak to you tonight. I'm not usually one to quote Mao Zedong, but sayings is quite accurate. Women hold up half the sky. And if you don't believe me, take a look at the ancient Egyptians where women held up all of the sky. The goddess Nut, whose body literally was the celestial sphere. So women have a very long history in relation to astronomy. But when we look at American culture, it's not really quite as long or illustrious until recent times, unless you dig deeper. Because the women were there, they just weren't getting all of the credit that they should have. So if you Google first woman American astronomer, you will always get Mariah Mitchell. And it is pronounced Mariah. Mariah Mitchell from the 19th century. She was a librarian for 24 years on her island home of Nantucket, not too far away from both you or I. And she became famous, worldwide famous, for discovering a comet in 1847. And in fact, at that point, there was actually a gold medal for discovering a comet. And she was in competition and she had to report it to the director of the Harvard Observatory, who would help her to actually report it so that she could get credit for this discovery. She was basically self-taught. I mean, being a librarian, you have more books than you could ever want, right? Plus also her father ran a school for a time on Nantucket. And very interestingly, it was the first integrated school that allowed colored children to actually attend. She became the first astronomy professor at Vassar College when it opened up after the Civil War. And many of her students went on to become astronomers in their own right. Mary Whitney was her successor at Vassar. Carolyn Furness then succeeded Mary Whitney. And Carolyn Furness was the first woman to receive a PhD from Columbia just over 120 years ago. Margaretta Palmer was the first woman to receive a PhD in astronomy in America, and this was at Yale. And interestingly, her thesis was on the comet, the orbit of the comet that made her mentor, Mariah Mitchell, famous. And another claim to fame of Margaretta Palmer is that she's one of the earliest people to have died in a car accident. Tony Amori,
Women drivers.
Harvard College Observatory on spectroscopy. She was one of the famous women who were the computers that you might have heard of at Harvard, who worked for literally 25 cents an hour working on the spectroscopic plates.
So they didn't hire men.
So many women who were working at Harvard that it became known as Pickering's harem. E.C. Pickering was the director of the Harvard College Observatory, and he had limited funds and he had limited staff, but he had a core of people who were interested in astronomy but had not been given a chance to do astronomy, namely women. The first women that he actually hired were the relatives of the astronomers there at Harvard. But then he opened it up to other women to come work at Harvard, basically working not in the observatory, because that wasn't considered women's work, because you'd have to do that at night in the dark, but women during the daylight hours in the comfort of the hall, the brick building at Harvard, could look at photographs and could look and make light curves and could do computations and look at spectroscopy. And so I highly recommend Dava Sobel's book, The Glass Universe, which talks about how the ladies of Harvard Observatory really changed what we know about the universe. An organization that's near and dear to my heart is the AAVSO, the American Association of Variable Star Observers. They're a pro-am collaboration. They were formed in 1911. They had a long history with Harvard, had a little bit of a breakup from Harvard. And interestingly or ironically, when we just sold the headquarters building last year, Harvard now has all of our archives. The first formal meeting of the AAVSO was 1917 at the Harvard College Observatory. Here is the picture, and it is a who's who of Northeastern American astronomy. And hopefully you will see that while women were in the minority for a scientific organization of the time, there were a lot of women involved. You have Anne Sewell Young, who was a professor of astronomy at Mount Holyoke. You have Leah Allen, who was a professor at Hood College. You have two of the Harvard College Observatory computers, Annie Jumpcannon and Henrietta Leavitt, who you might know from Leavitt's law, the period luminosity relationship of Cepheid variables that we use to get the scale of the universe. We also have a few notable here. We have E.C. Pickering, the director of Harvard. We have William Tyler Alcott from Connecticut, Norwich, Connecticut, noted amateur astronomer, and Leon Campbell, the first recorder, the position that later became the director of the AAVSO. So women have always had a long history as part of the AAVSO. The director of the AAVSO was Margaret Mayall. She was director from 1949 to 1973. And she caught the variable star from spending 2 summers as a student on Nantucket. Because after Mariah Mitchell passed, an observatory was built on Nantucket in her honor. And it was meant to be an educational facility, and especially to give opportunities to young women to learn about astronomy. And one of the types of objects that the Mariah Mitchell Observatory became known for was measurements of variable stars. So again, Mariah Mitchell, after her death, was giving opportunities for women to be involved in astronomy. So Margaret Mayall spent 2 summers as a student at the Mariah Mitchell Observatory, became the director of the Mariah Mitchell Observatory, and then the AAVSO director. But the woman who I just cannot say the most enough about, and I don't know is there anyone here besides me who had the honor of knowing Dorrit Hoffleit? Any here? Dorrit was an institution in astronomy. She lived literally a century, and her life is something that we should all aspire to have a passion, to be able to be paid to do your passion, and to give back to others. I consider Dorrit one of my personal mentors. Was always in the shadow of her older brother. Her older brother, Herbert, who was a classics specialist, was considered the brilliant older brother. And she was always considered dumb Dorrit, the dumb younger sister. And so firmly ingrained in her that once she even finished her bachelor's degree at Radcliffe, she didn't think she was smart enough to go on for graduate work. And it wasn't until people of the of Shapley and Bach told her, yes, you are brilliant, Dorrit. You are an astronomer. You should go on for your master's and then your PhD, that she actually did so. So here's an AAVSO meeting in 1930 at the beginning of her master's. And you can see that her two incredible mentors are there. Dorrit has the blue arrow above her head. Bart Bach is in a young Bart Bach is in the back. And, Harvard College Observatory Director Harlow Shapley is there in front of Dorrit. So I really hope that you take away from my talk tonight the importance of mentoring and of paying it forward, and of saying that kind word to someone who might be feeling self-doubt. So during World War II, most of the astronomers at Harvard did what they called war work. They did something for the US military. As Dorrit was a woman, she couldn't go to the front line, obviously, but she actually worked on calculations for the ballistic tables. And after World War II, she actually decided to leave Harvard and live on soft money, live on grant money. And this was done because she didn't like the politics in the Harvard College Observatory. What I usually say about university politics is never have so many fought so hard over so little. Politics are just incredibly known for being nasty. And the Harvard politics were apparently especially nasty. So she gave up this essentially tenured position at Harvard to go to Yale and keep applying for grants to fund her own position. And for many years, she only had a half-time position, half-year position at Yale. The other half of the year, she was at, again, hopefully you're seeing a trend here, Uriah Mitchell Observatory in Nantucket. She took over after Margaret Mayall took over full-time for the AAVSO. So during the warm months, she was on Nantucket, and she spent the winter in Connecticut. And so here there's actually a painting of Dorrit that was done by one of the students that hangs inside the observatory at Vestal Street in Nantucket. So over 2 decades, 102 women and 3 young men conducted research in the summers on variable stars. And they presented findings at the AAVSO Fall Conference, and they often published their results in the Journal of the AAVSO. So these students really were living astronomers. They did astronomical research, they published, and they presented their work. And 35 of her former students became professional astronomers. And it is, even to this day, a badge of honor to be called one of Dorrit's girls. Although, again, there were 3 young men, including John Briggs. And if you call John Briggs one of Dorrit's girls, he will gush about what an honor that is to have that. And in fact, in this picture with Dorrit in the front row, next to her is Sarah Beck, who just literally like 2 weeks ago retired after working at the AAVSO for over 30 years. So one of the things about Dora, she was one of the greatest cheerleaders for the AAVSO. She served on its council for many years. She worked her way up the ranks from second vice president to first vice president to president to past president. She was on the editorial board for the journal, and she hosted a number of AAVSO meetings at the Maria Mitchell Observatory while she was director. And Dorrit loved telling the story of the infamous Nantucket fog, i.e. the summer meeting of 1969. This is a picture of a very young Janet Maddie before she was married, Janet Akyaz, who was from Turkey. And she was one of the people who was working with Dorrit at the Maria Mitchell Observatory. So this young girl working at the observatory with Dorrit, what happened was that because of the fog, Dorrit could not take the ferry over from where she was at Harvard to Nantucket. So she was going to be late for the AAVSO. So this young girl had to run the AAVSO conference by herself and did such a tremendous job that a couple of years later, when Margaret Mayle wanted an assistant, she immediately hired Janet, and then Janet took over as director of the AAVSO a year later at the age of 30. So the Nantucket fog was very instrumental in the life and career of this young woman who left us way too early, unfortunately taken from us due to leukemia while she was only, I believe, in her 50s. So here in 1982, if you went to the headquarters of the AAVSO in Cambridge, it was called the Kingdom of Women, because this was the staff of the AAVSO. What do you notice? Not only is it women, but there is also diversity. Amazing to see that. And that was Janet. And where did Janet get that from? She got it from Dorrit. And Elizabeth Wagon right here, this beautiful young lady, you see the purple in front of her, she's still working at the AAVSO. She is still there today. And that's the whole point, is that it's much. So a little bit about me. There's me in grad school. You can tell what time it was because Halley's Comet was all the rage. I started grad school in January of 1985. I went to the University of Connecticut to work on black holes with Ron Millett. And so he was one of my greatest mentors. But one of the other institutions that's been near and dear to my heart is Stellafane. I went to Stellafane for the first time when I was 16, when I was a member of the Astronomical Society of New Haven. And I wanted to go back, but I couldn't go back until I got my first car. I didn't get my first car till I was in grad school. So I have not missed a Stellafane since 1985, but my first one was actually in 1979. And so circa 1990, when I was finishing grad school and starting my career as a professor, I met this very colorful character in the upper left, Caspar Hausfeld, Cap. He was the former chair of the AAVSO Solar Division. If any of you have met him up at Stellafane or anywhere else, colorful character. He had his Hausfeld wedge that he used for solar observing. He also had his homemade seismometer and his homemade gravity wave detector. And I was looking at all of his equipment, and he sucked me into solar observing. And so I got a solar filter for my 6-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain, and I started sending him solar for the American Radio Relay League. And then he said, you know, you've got the hang of this solar observing stuff. You should submit your solar observations to the AAVSO. Little did I know what I was getting into. So I said, sure, I'll send my solar observations to the AAVSO. So here you see some of my observations from 1992. 2 years later, I found myself interviewing Dorrit Hofflight at Yale. And at this point, in Dorrit's career, she was still doing astronomy, but she was really heavily involved in recovering the history of women astronomers in the United States, especially women who had done work in variable star astronomy. And so I was beginning to do work on this as well. And so I interviewed her down at Yale with my little cassette recorder. And I was asking her questions about the famous women at Harvard, because she actually knew some of them. She actually worked with Antonia Mori back in the 20s and 30s. So she could tell me about these women, their personality. And here's the personal note that she sent me. Best wishes on your projects. And from this time on, she was one of my personal mentors. A year later, in 1995, I was invited by Janet Maddie to be involved in a teacher program at the AAV. Here I am with a bad dye job and a bad perm. We're working on a project called Hands-on Astrophysics to use variable star astronomy for middle school and high school curriculum. And then from there, I started attending the AAVSO annual meetings. And here I am in the front row. And then from there, Janet Maddie said to me, "You will run for council." And you have to understand, Janet, I'm short, I'm 5'2". Janet was several inches shorter than me. But when Janet said something to you, it was like she was the Jolly Green Giant. It was, "Yes, ma'am, I will do it." And so she told me, "You will run for council of the AVSO," and I did. And so I was a counselor for a term of 2 terms of 2 years. And here I am with Dorrit and Janet, and it's a completely accident that we're all wearing the same color. There was nothing planned there. And then where do you go from there? Well, once you're sucked into the AVSO, you never get out. I became vice president. 3 years as president. I am now board secretary. I am co-section leader of the solar observing section. And I'm very proud to have won the director's award from the AAVSO as well. So again, Dorrit was right when she said that the AAVSO is a special organization. And again, these people who get involved and stay involved for decades. And so in giving it back, I have made sure that my students have the opportunity to be involved with this wonderful organization. 2 of my students presenting their very first conference presentations at an AAVSO meeting. So how are we doing with women in astronomy? Well, the percentage of women with bachelor's degrees is going up. It's still a minority. Both PhDs and bachelors, we have a ways to go, but we are making some progress. And we are trying our best to help women see themselves in astronomy. The IAU, Women and Girls in Astronomy, sort of year of women in astronomy, and had lots of programming online. The Astronomical Society of the Pacific has a lot of tools for clubs and any other organization. They also work with scouts to try to get women and get girls interested in astronomy. And they have these videos about girl-friendly astronomy engagement, which I highly recommend. These are available on their website. And people are paying attention to the issues of women in astronomy. You might recognize this lovely former cardiologist over here on the right-hand side, my friend Mario. Mario, member of how many astronomy clubs? This is an at-mob picture. And my friend here, Eileen, who's also a member of the Springfield Telescope Makers. Amateur astronomers have also been making incredible strides in making astronomy accessible to all. And so I want to give a shout out to a few women in amateur astronomy that I really think are just, they are just it. They're hot. So Eileen Myers from the ATMOB, the Amateur Telescope Makers of Boston, and the STM. She's the driving force behind the annual Observing Olympics at Stellafane. She is my partner in crime in putting together the technical talks of programming at the Stellafane convention. She's like the Energizer Bunny. Noreen Grice, who used to work at the Science Museum in Boston at their planetarium. She's the president-elect of the Mid-Atlantic Planetarium Society. She has done a tremendous work for the visually impaired in astronomy. She has a number of books, Braille books, and has an LLC, You Can Do Astronomy, and she is a specialist in accessible astronomy, not just for people who are visually impaired, but for all sorts of physical differences. Rachel Freed, she is the Energizer Bunny. This woman is amazing. She's a former high school teacher. She's now completing a PhD in astronomy education. She is a leader in student research using robotic telescopes and is the co-founder and president of the Institute for Student Astronomical Research, or INSTAR. And it's women of all generations. Caitlin Goulet, she is an elected member of the Springfield Stars Club Board of Directors. This is a very young girl. She organized an astronomy club in her middle school. She produces a monthly astronomy newsletter called Starry Scoop that you can subscribe to. And she does a constellation segment in the Springfield Science Museum's monthly AstroQuest Zoom program. I expect amazing things out of this young woman when she gets into high school and college and beyond. And Lauren Harrington, the tie-dye astronomer. She is part of the AAVSO Ambassador Program. She is a volunteer. She is a webinar coordinator for the AAVSO online programming, and she is in love with amateur spectroscopy and has put together a website helping people get involved in this great way of gathering scientifically useful information. Dr. Barbara Harris, she is a retired OBGYN, and she co-discovered the 2010 outburst of Nova Scorpii. She's a very active observer. She's a former council member, and again, an incredible role model for women in astronomy. She's won awards for her astrophotography. Her setup down in Florida is absolutely amazing. So I hope that I've given you this idea that the AAVSO is one of many organizations in astronomy that has embraced this idea that women hold up half the sky. And so I want all of you, regardless of your gender, to think about becoming involved in the AAVSO, because we welcome everyone, regardless of your previous knowledge or experience. We have a huge number of observing sections. When you think variable stars, you might think one type of thing like Miras or Cepheids, but we have an incredible number of observing sections. Again, the sun is a variable star. I love the sun. I get to observe during the day, but I only get one data point a year, so a data point a day. So I can only do so many observations per year, whereas some of these people who do CCDs get hundreds of thousands of data points. I get one per day. One of our very popular observing sections is the exoplanet, run by Dennis Conti. That's very popular, where you actually observe transiting exoplanets and you can submit data to our database. So I want to thank you for your attention, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Hang on. Okay, is sound back on, folks? Can you hear me?
I can.
I can.
Right, that's all that counts. Do we have any questions online? Let's start there.
What's AAVSO stand for? I got here late.
American Association of Variable Star Observers.
There I go. Thanks.
Although we are international, we did start out of Harvard. Any discussions about changing the name and, changing. So we're staying with the American, even though we are clearly international.
Thank you. Excellent talk.
Thank you.
I have
know
a,
that- I know
Dr.
women were really powerful with being the computers of the day.
Oh, yeah.
And they were the only ticket in town. It's a good thing they were doing what they were doing, or nothing would have been calculated.
You're exactly. Eleanor, you have a hand raised.
Yes, I do. I have a question. What can individual clubs do to encourage women coming into the club and mentoring them? I have had the benefit of mentors. It's meant a great deal.
A lot of times you will hear the horror stories about people who were put off. And there is sort of a repetitive message, and that is first impressions mean a lot. So when a young lady, or of any age, a not so young lady, walks in the door, make them comfortable. It's even just so simple as avoiding sexist language and treating them like, not like a unicorn, like, oh my God, there's a woman here. What are you doing? There are people who get treated, and they have horror stories about this. Just welcoming, being very welcoming, not assuming that because they're a woman, they are, rank beginner, and just welcoming them and asking them, what's your particular interest? What equipment do you have? What would you like to contribute to the club? The ASP, the Astronomical Society of the Pacific videos that I had, they have some really good ideas about mentoring and about gender differences in learning, and just how to have a welcoming sort of atmosphere for girls and young women. And you also have to understand that in some cases, there are also cultural differences. And for some young women, being in a group that is predominantly men at night is difficult. So there are things that you need to think about, making them, maybe having some activities during the day, and making young women feel comfortable being with a group of older men. Let's face it, like, I'm turning 60 this year, right? I mean, so, let's look at the demographic. Let's be honest. So if you have a young girl, making them feel comfortable, having their parents feel comfortable about having this young lady in this situation. And so it's a lot of it really just comes down to respect and comfort. And once you get a certain percentage of women, then it doesn't seem quite as unicorny. And I know that when I was in grad school, being a woman and having an African-American man as my advisor, the two of us would walk into physics conferences and people would literally spin their heads around like a top staring at us, because we were the only woman and Black person in the entire room. And that sends a very powerful negative message. So again, the one thing you don't want to do is to make these people feel like they are an oddity. It has to feel natural. Wow, welcome. You might think to yourself, whoa, there's a young girl in the room. This is great. But don't let them know that you're thinking that this is sort of a out of the ordinary situation.
Thank you. I was pleased to see in a PBS episode of Star Chasers of Senegal, where it was filmed in Africa, that there were female astronomers participating in all the research. It was nice.
Yeah, there are actually some countries where the percentage of women in astronomy is much higher, much closer to being 50-50 than it is in the United States. So we've made strides, but we still have a way to go. And that's both amateur and professional, so.
Kristine, I'm gonna stop your screen share so we can see faces a little better, if that's all right.
You know what?
No? Okay, actually, those are a lot of good sort of hands-on thoughts. Is there a single sort of systemic, maybe even organizational outrage you can share with us where we should direct our energy politically, economically, anything on a large scale, not quite so personal?
The personal is, it turns out that the personal is actually the way to go. I actually did a survey of attendees to Stellafane a number of years ago. And I asked, how did you get involved in astronomy? And the males, it was an isolated thing, like it was a book that got them interested or a movie or something. For the women, it was predominantly some sort of relationship. It was a relative. It was a friend. It was that personal relationship of someone who invited them in and showed them the beauty and wonder of astronomy. So I think that it's that personal connection that really means a lot. And it's, again, it's this whole thing about the mentoring. And yes, it is much more labor intensive when you're doing it sort of one-on-one, but it's so much rewarding when you see that person reaching their potential and being able to share their share of the universe.
Okay, but once they're in, it's a level playing field, funding, all of that.
Yep.
What? Bill, go ahead.
Yes, Kristen, Bill Waller here. I want to ask you about the recent history of the AAVSO, including its leadership. Apparently, it's changed recently, and where you are located physically.
Okay, Stella took a position in Cambridge. She is now the head of the American Meteorological Society, which is a much huger organization than the AAVSO. So it was definitely a promotion for her, a challenge to a different science, but definitely a much larger organization. So I'm good friends with Stella, and I'm sad to see her go from our organization, but it was an incredible opportunity for her. We did sell the building, and we moved right down the road. If you know where the Alewife subway is, we're in an office building within spitting distance of the Alewife subway station.
So you're referring to Stella Kafka.
Yep. Yep.
Thank you.
Brian Kloppenberg is now the director. Yeah, he hit the ground running, what, 3 months ago, 4 months ago, and has a lot of good ideas. And so we'll see where the next chapter takes us.
A follow-up question. Speaking of girls in astronomy, I know, going back to the early 2000s, there was a big push for Girl Scouts in astronomy. I'm just wondering where that has led.
The ASP has been intimately involved in that. And the materials that I mentioned that the ASP has, a lot of the videos about making girl-friendly astronomy, those were developed as part of their partnership with the Girl Scouts.
Mm-hmm.
So that relationship definitely has blossomed. And again, the Astronomical Society of the Pacific has really taken the lead on that.
Okay, thank you.
Anybody else have a question for our guest? All right, well, once again, Kristine, thank you for a wonderful talk.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.
And your much sought after sweatshirt is on its way.
Yay.
And that logo, by the way, yes, that is the Voyager shot of Neptune.
Okay, all right.
Kristine, I look forward to seeing you at the Astronomical Society of the Palm Beaches. You're going to come and speak on variable stars.
I am.
Yeah, I'll see you at Stellafane. Yeah.
Very cool.
All right, well, thank you, everybody.
Thank you for inviting us. Have a good night, Mike.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Enjoy your cake. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, Patty.